Okay, so welcome everybody. Once again, thank you very much for joining. My name is Asif Rahmani, and I'm the host of today's webinar on project management using SharePoint 2010 Foundation. Our presenter today is Eric Eaton, SharePoint architect, and also has written much training curriculum, has taught a lot of different courses. Let me talk a little bit briefly about Eric first, and then I'll let him introduce himself a little bit further. And then I'll talk about also what we are going to be presenting today, just briefly, and then he'll do most of course, the real presentation. So Eric and I actually go way back. We've been teaching and consulting on SharePoint specifically for a very long time. Eric has also taught classes on project management. He's a master of many subjects within SharePoint. And he has authored a DVD on project management as well, which is on our site right now for sale. I'll talk to you about the DVD in just a minute. This webinar today is going to be focusing on project management using SharePoint 2010 Foundation. The reason it says Foundation here means, of course, any SharePoint flavor that you have, SharePoint Server, SharePoint Foundation, whatever you have, this techniques that Eric will be showing you here and the techniques that are in the DVD will work, is what it means. So you don't really have to pay for the SharePoint Server licensing or get Project Server or get Microsoft Project to do what he's about to talk to you about. Project management is, of course, a must, in all variety of engagements that you have, and he'll show you, he'll talk about how you can take advantage of the fundamental knowledge and the fundamental pieces, the building blocks within SharePoint, to get a nice view of your running projects and be able to manage the tasks and other pieces of multiple projects. Okay? Let me talk to you briefly about this DVD that we have, and I'll show you exactly where it is on our site. Currently it is on sale. We just launched it. This is the Project Management using SharePoint 2010 DVD. The coupon codes, as you can see, SP Webinar is a coupon code that anybody can use until March 9th to get 10% off. Oops, there's a typo here, by the way. Hang on a second. This should not be term storage, it should be project management. Sorry about that. That was our last DVD that we launched. So this is the 10% off the project management DVD until 2012. If you are a member of our site, subscribe member, you can get 25% off using the member DVD coupon. Okay, let me just quickly show you where the stuff is, and then I'll hand it over to Eric to get started. Just a second. Okay, so this is our site, SharePoint-videos.com. You should see it in just a second. There we go. And if you go to SharePointVideos.com, go to Products, SharePoint DVD Packages under Products. You'll see all the different DVDs that we offer. They're all video tutorials on fundamentals, SharePoint Designer, SharePoint Designer workflows, business connectivity services, reporting services, access, branding, taxonomy, and now project management. Okay, so right here is project management. Once you go into project management using SharePoint 2010 DVD, it'll come up in just a second over there. You'll see the summary of exactly what the tutorials are all about. And at the bottom of this page, you're going to see the list of the videos within this package. So overview, task tracking, summary, reporting, and other things. All right, well, I've spoken enough now. I want to get started on time with the actual meat and potatoes of the webinar, what you're here to see, which is project management, fundamentals, and others that you can do in SharePoint 2010 Foundation. So I would like to introduce our presenter, Eric Eaton. Eric, are you there?
I am here.
Great. Go ahead and feel free whenever you're ready to take the presentation over.
Okay, great. My name is Eric Eaton, as Asif mentioned. I'm a SharePoint architect. And I come from a general IT background, and anytime you have to do architect type work, or even just as a contributor in IT, you wind up finding yourself as part of a lot of projects. As an architect, having to manage and run those projects as well. So I am not, as they say in the theater, a classically trained project manager. but I have had to be around it a lot, and I've had to experience many times the painful tools that get used a lot of times to help with project management. I used to teach classes for Microsoft Project, client application, Microsoft Office, and a little bit about basic project theory classes as well. So I'm familiar with many of the problems that you face. In fact, many of you may have a start kind of similar to mine, where you really weren't trained in project management. You just had to figure it out along the way because your job demanded it. The good news is there are quite a few things that we can do to help with that, and that really is the purpose of the video series and of this webinar. Share my screen here. It's to show you how SharePoint can help to solve some of those common problems that you wind up with in SharePoint. Now, in order to do that, you need to understand a little bit about some of the basics in SharePoint. And on the SharePoint Videos website, there are literally hundreds of videos that are helpful with specific skills and specific questions, specific concepts in SharePoint. So we don't want to spend too much time on all those fundamentals because there's things already out there for those. But a little bit of context, what we're looking at the moment is a project tasks list in SharePoint. Now, there are several, shall we say, elements or building blocks in SharePoint that can be used to create a solution that can help. Let's say that our goal is to track our project tasks, but we have a couple of specific requirements. We don't want to do it all ourselves. We want our project team to be involved, perhaps even using some Scrum methodology where we have a daily stand-up meeting and the team members themselves are able to decide what tasks they're working on currently, commit to those, and to also be responsible for entering their own status updates in those tasks. We also would like to have some way to track planned values versus actual values. For instance, we planned a certain task to start on December 3rd, as it shows here. When did it actually start and finish versus when we planned it? So how do we do that? Well, there are several building blocks to look at. First of all, I'm going to go into site settings in SharePoint to talk about a concept called a content type. A content type is a building block in SharePoint that really is just a package of settings. It's configuration that specifies what an item is. For instance, if you have a calendar in SharePoint, then an item in the calendar is called an event. If you have a task list in SharePoint, the item inside it is called a task. As you see down here, you'll see that that is already created for us. We'll temporarily go to the site where that's housed at the moment. Notice if we click on the standard SharePoint task, it has a title, it has a predecessors field, priority, task status, so it has several columns, each of different data types that specify the type of information we ask the user to fill out, and then also some rules about how those get entered. For instance, in the date and time field, you might want just the date, or you might want both the date and the time. So a content type allows you to create this package of settings. Now you could also do that in a SharePoint list. The difference with a content type is that if you do it here, it provides consistency throughout your portal, throughout a whole hierarchy of sites. You can create this package once, and then in all of your lists, you can choose to use content type, and then you don't have to make sure you remember to put the same columns into each list. It also helps you when you go to do workflow automation, because every one of those list has the same content type in it, then you can count on the same settings being available in each one. It also helps you when it's time to roll things up because, again, you have consistent settings across all of these lists through all of the sites. So a content type is a really basic, fundamental building block of SharePoint, and one that's very important for this type of solution. Now, the task I'm looking at the moment is not the type of task that we're going to use. You may have noticed that there were planned versus actual. There were no roll-up fields, things like that. Well, if you look at my screen again, here we find that we have a custom project task that is created based on the parent of the out-of-the-box SharePoint task. It has a longer list of fields in it. Notice it has planned start finish versus an actual start and finish. It also has just a plain start date and finish date. Now, why would you do that? Well, notice that these two fields are hidden. It means they won't show up in a form when you go to create a new task. The idea being that these would be auto-populated. So sometimes when we're looking at a task, or excuse me, when we're looking at our project, our list of tasks, we would want to project out based on our current data, what we have already, what's been accomplished in our tasks to date, and also what's planned in the schedule going forward. To do that, we would need a combination of the planned start and the actual start. If a task has already been started in real life, then we would want the start date to show us the actual start date. If that hasn't happened yet, then we would want to see the planned start date instead. So by having a separate pair of fields for these, and in fact the percent complete would be the same way, then we are to have a dynamic value that helps us with our charting, with our visual views. Something else to point out. There, it seems happier. Lost my connection for a moment. Something else to point out is that we have a calculated column here. Calculated columns and Word are two of your wild card when you're building things in SharePoint. If you're trying to find a way to accomplish something and it's a little challenging, go back to those two wild cards. By using a combination of those two, you'll usually be able to accomplish what you want. Notice what we're doing here. We are trying to calculate how far along we expect the task to be based on today's date and when we planned for it to start and finish. Now to do that, we have to calculate a duration. So the first part of this formula, notice, is taking the finish date minus the start date. Now these are the dynamic dates. So actual if it's present. If actual is not available, then use the planned values. So the finish date minus the start date, and then we add 1 gives us the duration of the task as it's currently in the schedule. Once we have that overall duration, we can then divide it by the difference between today's date and the start date, plus 1. That way, let's say the start date is Monday and the finish date is Friday and today is Wednesday. Well, the duration up at the top would be 5 days. The duration for the second half of the formula would be 3 days. So 5 divided by 3 would give us 60%. So a content type site columns are very helpful for us to create a package of settings that define what a project task is. The columns that you choose to do this will vary depending on your organization and on your preferences as a project manager. But there are other things that may be helpful in here as well. For instance, if you're working in a Scrum environment, you may want to know what sprint this particular task is being worked on. We have things such as previous status to keep track of changes to the status. Someone goes from not started to in progress. That's a way that a workflow automation later can be able to tell that a change happened in the status. We have some other fields down here that are really only helpful for roll-ups. If we're looking at items that come from many different sites, then it's nice to have the name of what site it came from as well as links to get to those areas. So content type is a very basic building block. A list is something different. List is a container or a box. And if we go look at the list settings for the sample list, you'll notice that the project task has already been added. Therefore, all columns that were created as part of that content type have been automatically added into this list. Now technically, we could create columns here, we could add other columns here, all that can be done as part of a list as well. But remember, doing it as a content type makes things consistent for us. It gives us more capability for working with things across sites and across lists. Other things that have to do with the list. Remember, this is the package that contains those items defined by content types. So other things we can do is we can specify versioning. For instance, on our project tasks, we might want to keep a version history for these. So if someone makes some type of an edit that we decide wasn't a good idea, we can revert to a previous version of that task. Very valuable feature in a list. We have other changes in here as well. We can change permissions. Since it's a container, we can decide who is able to get into this container, into this list of project tasks, who's able to read, who's able to write, even who's able to delete if we wish. Other common settings in a list have to do graphically with views that could be created. What columns would we like to display? Would we like to filter things? Would we like to group things? So a list has to do with how we're going to package our contents instead of just how they're set up. Now what we're looking at in this list has a Gantt chart view. And a Gantt chart shows us a grid on the left where we can actually make edits to the records that are in play. And we also have a chart on the right that shows this against a calendar grid that helps us to see things visually, including such things as predecessor relationships. Now you'll notice in my grid over on the left, I've configured this view so that we have the actual values. The usage scenario for this would be that the task list has already been created. This is the place where I can do my tracking of things as they occur. Now remember, one of the requirements we had, however, was that we wanted to be able to have our team members do their task updates themselves rather than me have to do that as a project manager. That accomplishes a couple of things. First of all, it means that our team members will be coming to our project site frequently, hopefully multiple times a day as they're working on tasks. That means if we decide to do other things such as announcements, such as discussion forums, like our project forum over here, if we assign action items or risks and issues, all of those will be front and center in the site, and people will see those because they're coming here to do daily updates. The other thing it accomplishes is it keeps them more involved in the process itself. They are thinking and planning more about what tasks they commit to. They are keeping in touch with what's on their plate so that they don't forget things as easily. It also means, of course, that it's less work for me to do manually. But how do we do that? Well, we have an example of a storyboard page that is commonly used for projects that are working in a Scrum model. What I found in my experience is that most organizations don't use any project methodology purely. They do some combination of Scrum or Agile or Waterfall or some other type of project methodology, sometimes even one they just made up themselves because it works for the type of work they're in. That's one of the advantages of SharePoint, is that it's not a prefabricated tool. It's something that you can build and adapt to whatever the needs are for you and your organization, your team. What I'm looking at now is used many times in Scrum or Agile. You may have seen this type of effect before just on a whiteboard or on a wall in the office, where Postit notes are put up to keep track of what tasks have been committed to for the current iteration of the project, and then also what progress those tasks are in. Postit notes can just be moved across to different areas of the wall as they go to the in progress state and eventually to the done state. What we have here is a Webpart page in SharePoint that helps to duplicate the same thing. Let's look at how that works, and then we'll talk more about what a Webpart page is. When we click on the Edit button, the form for this task opens up, showing all those columns that we created as part of our content type. Now, if we wanted to say that this task was now on progress, you'll notice there is a task status down here at the bottom, where I can simply mark it as in progress, click Save, and the Postit note moves to the next part of the Webpart page, into the next area of the wall, so to speak. Now, what does that mean? How does this work? Well, if we switch over to SharePoint Designer, what we're looking at is a page, and a page is a piece of content in the site. So the page is in a list or a library called Site Pages, as you notice over here on the left, just like our tasks are in a list called Project Tasks. If we go to edit the page itself, give it a moment to open here. The type of page we're creating is called a Webpart page. And as it implies, a Webpart page contains several web parts. Each one of those web parts being kind of a little nugget of SharePoint that we want to display in a certain format. So the format we're using here is something that looks like Postit Notes. You'll notice that what I've clicked on gets this blue outline. We're working in what's called a Webpart zone, which is a container that holds several web parts. And what's highlighted in blue now is a web part. This is a type of web part called a data view web part. And it allows us to specify where the data comes from, how we want it to look, and then to do extra things such as totaling up hours, for instance, in this case. Now, rather than walk through this entire piece and explain what's here, let's create a page that's similar to this. I will close the page we have open. I will go to make a new part page, and I'm going to pick this one with 3 columns since I know I'll have 3 columns for not started, in progress, and done. Call it something really original here. If we click in one of these zones, this gives us a nice prefabricated layout so we don't have to worry about aligning things ourselves. On the Insert ribbon, I can choose to insert a data view. All of the lists and libraries, or all of the containers that exist in my current site, show up here for me to pick from. I'm going to pick the Project Tasks list. And the web part will insert itself and then talk to that list in the background that we looked at in the browser a few moments ago. And it shows us all the data that it finds there. Now in my case, I don't want all of the data that it finds there. I only want a subset of columns, and in reality I'm only going to want the tasks in this web part that are not started, which in this case is none at the moment. So let's make a couple of changes. Let's first of all talk about the columns that are involved. You'll notice that it comes with a preset package of these columns. I'm going to remove ones that I don't need. The only things that I'm really interested in seeing at this point are the title, so I can see the name of the task. Notice there are 3 variations of title. We can have title that is just a plain text entry, or we can have them that are links, such as the link to open the item, or a link with the little drop-down menu of choices in which you get in a SharePoint list. I want just the plain title, and the reason for that is I'm going to create a separate little edit button. That's perhaps a little easier on the eyes and a little easier to work with for someone that may not be familiar with all that SharePoint does. Notice we can select them, we can choose what order we want these to be in. Click OK. And now it shows just the columns that I wanted to see. So we're halfway there, but this doesn't look anything like a Postit note yet. But a web part can be reformatted to do that for us. You'll notice that when I'm clicked on the web part, I get this List View Tools area on the ribbon. And on the Design tab of that area, I have several choices for the way this could be arranged, or the style of web part. We have a couple of here that are boxed, and I'm going to pick the one that is boxed with labels, although in reality I'm going to get rid of the labels. But you notice it reformats everything so that my columns now look like rows of information, each in its own box. Now this is a little messy for me since I don't have a lot of columns in my web part. I probably don't really need to have the titles visible. I wanted this type of a web part because at least I get this little spacer over here, which makes it easy for me to indent the data that I really want to see. Maybe I want the title of the task to be in bold so it stands out a little more when we're looking at things. Maybe I want the edit button to be right aligned. Here's an interesting trick. If we choose to right align when I'm clicked in as a character, notice how it right aligns all of the values in the Postit note? We don't want that. Let me undo. If you want to realign just the piece you're looking at, for instance the picture that looks like a piece of paper and a pencil, If I click right on the picture instead of next to it with the cursor, and then I do a right align, it moves just the picture, which is what we wanted. I'm also going to make the height of the rows a little taller so I get a little more spacing in between each one of them, maybe a little more than I need. Again, helps with the formatting. It'll look more shaped like a post-it that way. Plus, it's just easier to read. Now, you'll notice that I've got these extra column labels at the top, the column headings. Those can be done away with. Up on our ribbon, there's a Table tab. It gives us the ability to delete different parts of the table. I want to delete these cells. They all go away. Another thing we can do is we can add the total row that we mentioned before. This will give me a little more information than what I wanted. But again, I can delete cells that I didn't need. And it gives me more what I'm looking for. Put a better label in here. Now you'll notice that at the moment it's showing me things other than just the not started tasks. It's showing me ones that are done, ones that are in progress. Actually, there are none that are in the not started state in this example. So how do we change that? Well, on the Options tab of our ribbon, there's a Filter button. It allows us to pick which filter we want to filter by, which would be the task status. And then you could pick any of the preset values that are allowed in that column. Not started is the one I want. If we click OK, you'll notice they all disappear. I'm going to undo that for the moment, because for the rest of the demo we want to see some Post-it notes. Let's go in and make the change so that we only get a single column of Post-it notes. Now this is something that is a little more advanced, so if any of you listening are more SharePoint people rather than project management people, this may be interesting to you because it's not an obvious thing that can be changed. However, it is possible. If we switch over to Code View at the moment, you'll notice that we have about 300 some lines of code at the moment, including everything in the page that we've done so far. However, there are some changes we need to make that are not in that 300 lines of code. There's a lot more markup that goes into a web part like this that we see in 300 lines. The good news is, if we click inside our web part, and we go to the Design tab, we have this button up here that allows us to customize the XSLT, which is the markup that creates the structure of the web part. Now, if we choose to customize the entire view, what it does is it goes and gets all that standard markup that comes from SharePoint as a product and inserts it into the page itself. You'll notice now, if we go to the end, we have over 1,000 lines of code. Now, why would we want to do that? Because we want to make a couple of changes to what would normally be standard markup. One of the changes we want to make, I'll do Control-H to bring up the Find and Replace box, just like you can in other Office products, is we want to look for a little markup tag called Ghost. In videos, it documents this particular setting for you, which is good. You won't have to remember it this way. What this tag does is it tells the web part page, when it's rendering, to ignore some types of customization that a user may have done. We want to get that out of here. Let's choose Find X to make sure I spelled it right. You'll notice it found one for us. I'm going to choose to replace all. Every once in a while, the Find and Replace box does this. I'm not sure why. When clearly it found it, it'll say that it didn't. So I'll just manually replace each one of them. I should mention that this is different from unghosting a page itself. Again, for those of you that are SharePoint aficionados, I know that unghosting is sometimes a bad word in SharePoint. This is different than that. This is just talking about the markup within a web part. We have not done anything yet to unghost the page as a whole. Now, all we've done so far is to allow the type of change that we want to make. Again, let's go into the Find and Replace box. And this time we're going to look for the tag that tells it to be 2 columns. And we're going to replace that with a tag that changes it to 1 column. Again, we'll use the Find Next to make sure that it finds it. Should only find a couple of expressions of that. Now there are 2. And now if we go back to Design View, once it finishes thinking, you'll notice we have a single column. So a couple of little known tags or tricks in the Data View web part that help us to change the way it looks. This is a pretty common request that we get for a boxed data view to only be in 1 column instead of 2. Now again, I've got a couple of cells left over from the total row that I don't need anymore. If you recall, we can go to the Table tab of our ribbon. We can delete those cells. And now we're getting something that looks more and more like a row of Postit Notes. Give it a yellow background color. If when you do that it only applies to 1 column, which happens sometimes, just select the other column and apply it there as well. A couple of other things that we might want to do. On the Web Part tab, we might want to give this a more specific title for the web part. Since allegedly this is supposed to not started tasks, we'll call it that. And we might also want to give it a set width. If you're working and planning for a screen resolution of 1024 by 768, then you probably want about 1/3 or 1/4 of that. So let's say 256 pixels. And let's save our page. And let's publish it, or preview it, excuse me. And there it is. Now we're not going to spend a lot of time on all the formatting that goes, for instance, the width of columns in the table and things like that. Those are pretty standard formatting changes that are basically the same here as they would be in other HTML editing, or even sometimes something like InfoPath or Publisher, for instance. Very, very similar common tasks. But notice that it's working. We do get this if we click on the Edit button. The form for that task opens up. Changes can be made to change the status. And the Webpart page does what we wanted. Now let's say that we wanted to go ahead and create the rest of this page. We might want to select the Webpart. If I right-click, we can copy this Webpart, paste it into the next Webpart zone in our page, and it will duplicate the Webpart for us and all that setup work that we did. That way, one Webpart could be filtered for the task status not started, whereas the next one could be filtered for the task status in progress. And we'll change the title to match. Notice we have an empty one for the not started column, and we have one appropriately showing us 2 tasks for the in progress column. And the same thing could of course be done for the done column as well. So by using some fundamental concepts and building blocks in SharePoint, by creating content types that allows us to have standard settings for something like a project task across our entire site, even if we have multiple sites in a hierarchy. By creating a list that sets things such as version control and permissions and view settings so that we can work with something in that Gantt chart, for instance, that we looked at earlier. We create a container or a package that helps us to control and to present the items represented by our content types. By creating workflows, which we didn't really demo here today, but we talked about a little bit, we can automate the filling out of some of the columns in the background, things that we don't want the user to have to do. Again, so perhaps we get them consistent or we save work for the user. Sometimes those workflows will go and talk to other lists. For instance, all of our tasks, it would be nice if we could get that percentage or that status information to roll up and show a single line for the entire project to give us an idea of how the entire project is progressing. Excuse me, sorry. We could also create Webpart pages like what we have here to display things in formats that are more useful and more varied for different purposes.
There's a question here, Eric, that I wanted to put to you. You there, Eric?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Just something I would throw out here, something that Sue asked a while back, and it's a pretty good question, I think. Some of the stuff that we're doing, the web pages that you create for the Postit Notes and other things, her question was that, are they 508, Section 508 compliant?
For instance, vision impaired?
Yeah.
Yeah. SharePoint 2010 does go further in that direction than previous versions have. That is not something I'm an expert on. There is some information available on the Microsoft website, if I remember correctly. I know there's information online. I believe it's on the Microsoft website. It talks a bit about that. In real life, if you work for an organization where that becomes very important, then you're probably going to need to do a little more development type work, particularly if you're creating highly customized pages.
And you're so right, Eric, that definitely Microsoft is moving a lot more towards standardization and making things more compliant. But what you're seeing here, guys, what Eric is doing is using the fundamental pieces of SharePoint. So there's nothing that's separate from what SharePoint can do. This is all using the pieces to make the solution, the application that we need. So the 508 compliancy for SharePoint 2010, is it completely there? I would be lying to you if I said yes, it's there, because it's not. But Microsoft has statements about exactly how you can make things much more compliant, accessibility compliant, and 508 compliant. So definitely check that out. And whatever applies there, whatever the official statement is from Microsoft, is going to be the same official statement for what Eric is showing you over here. But like I said, Microsoft's direction has been, and they've said many times, that the SharePoint is going to become much more, is definitely going towards a route of more compliancy and more standardization and things. So hopefully we'll see some good things in the future.
That's a good question. That does come up fairly frequently in larger engagements.
Yeah.
With SharePoint.
Another thing that Sue was asking is, the unghosting that you did before. She was asking, and this might be something that you've already answered, but maybe it requires some re-answering here, is that why was the unghosting done? What was the main purpose?
Well, in particular, the change that we made to provide just a single column for the layout in the box data view, that's something that normally is not allowed or is hidden. So you make the change, and then you preview, and it looks like you did nothing. So when we go into the code and look for that DDWRT ghost tag, we're looking for all those things that tell SharePoint to ignore some of these changes. So the ghost tag is a little confusing sometimes, because it's similar to a larger ghosting issue in SharePoint that I was referring to before. The larger issue is that if we customize a page so that the page itself differs from the SharePoint standard Webpart pages, then it copies all of the code related for that page out of the templates and puts it into the content database, which can slow down performance a little bit. Probably more important than that is when it comes time to upgrade SharePoint to 2013 or whatever. I don't know what the next version of SharePoint is going to be. I haven't heard a date for anything like that. But when that happens, things that are from the templates that way, difficult to upgrade. They all have to be manually managed a bit. So that is kind of a dirty word in the SharePoint industry, is unghosting pages. It's very popular for power users because it means change more. But for the administrators, for architects and things like that, it's kind of a dirty word. What we did in this demo is not the same thing. It is just changing a tag. It's getting more markup within the web part so that we can make more formatting changes to the web part itself. The page itself is not unghosted. As you notice over here, my actual storyboard that I made in real life does have a couple of changes that unghost the page. That's what the blue eye means. However, the one that I did in the demo is this one down here. Notice it's still not unghosted. I don't know if that answers more than what you were asking, or if that's different, I'm not sure.
I think it's a good explanation. And just for everybody else's also understanding, you know, DDWRT that we were showing you before, you can search for it online and you'll find the explanation that this is actually a namespace. This has Webpart extensions for DataView Webpart. DataView Webpart uses that's quite a bit. And if you want to understand what DataView Webpart does a lot more in detail, how you can take advantage of it, the kind of stuff that Eric has already shown you, and other stuff, we have lots of videos, lots of tutorials online for that as well. So check that out.
Something else to point out about DataView Webparts, there's more than one type of DataView Webpart.
Right.
And in the project management video series, when you roll up tasks across projects for kind of a dashboard look, it talks about creating one that's a different type. You'll notice these are called an XSLT list view. And there's another type entirely that is done, just to point out, by going from more data sources instead of going from these. It creates a different type of web part that gives you even more formatting choices than what you get with these.
Absolutely. Yeah, DataView Webpart, I think many of us feel that it has grown up quite a bit, lots of different choices it has. And for some of us, that was one of the main reasons that we stopped developing. You know, I guess I'll raise my hand and say that that was one of the main reasons for me, because there's just so much you can do with that web part that you'll find some amazing things that you can, that you can accomplish. You don't really need to develop as much. Anyway, was there more things that you wanted to show, Eric?
No, that was what I had on the slate to demonstrate today.
Okay.
Do we have some other questions to work with?
Oh yes, absolutely. There's quite a bit of questions.
I can certainly just wax poetic about the subject, but
yeah, we try to give enough time at the end of the webinar for questions, everybody, and we've not done a great job, I should say, in the past, unfortunately. But this time, I think we're doing a pretty good job of getting done early with the actual demonstrations, what we had canned, so now we can talk about some things. And if something comes up, if a question comes up that's something that Eric can show, I'm sure he won't mind showing that as well. But at least we can discuss your perspectives and your specific question that you have in mind. So Eric, I'm going to go through some of the questions here. You're welcome to also go through them and tackle the ones that you want. Sure. One person here, Michael, was asking about, okay, here's the actual question. Can you talk about this here or somewhere else on how to use something like this with Microsoft Project?
That's a good question. And what we're demonstrating here, some of the customizations we do to a project task list, are not particularly compatible with the actual project plan application. However, that being said, with the 2010 version, Microsoft has made arrangements that if you're using the out-of-the-box project task list in SharePoint and you're using Project 2010 Professional, that the client application can interact with the SharePoint task list. You're no longer required to have Project Server do that, work across them. I'm not sure if that answers the question exactly, but they are compatible now.
Okay.
That was not true in previous or prior versions of SharePoint.
Gotcha. And something related to that, Melody is asking, how can you connect the project site to a SharePoint environment? Project site. I'm actually reading this myself and seeing what is the intent of this question.
I'm not sure
I don't know.
I understand the question either.
Yeah, I'm kind of a little bit confused also. So project site itself is a SharePoint site, Melody? You know, well, so if you're talking about project server is built on SharePoint interface of it is. So all the sites that you have are really SharePoint sites, and some of those can be used as for project management. And what Eric has been showing over here is how you can use SharePoint for project management without even needing project server. And correct me wherever I'm wrong, by the way, Eric.
No, you're right. Yeah, it's all SharePoint, no project server in any of this demo. What I found in my experience, honestly, I haven't used project server in this version in 2010. I had quite a bit of experience implementing it and trying to help an organization use it in the 2003 version. And I think project server is way overkill for what a lot of project managers need. If your entire organization is a project management organization and you need a tool to help do that across the enterprise, and everyone's of a culture already for that, and you have the enterprise resources available to manage it and to tweak it, then it's a valuable tool. In many cases, it's beyond what a day-to-day project manager needs or wants of overhead to keep track of. I've worked with a lot of dedicated project managers that anytime project server starts being talked about will dig in their heels and refuse to use it because it's so much work to do. It does some very powerful things. It's just what most people need. It's more than that. It's a sledgehammer to kill an ant.
That's a pretty good analogy. All right. Let me know if you have anything specific that you see in the question that you would like to tackle. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and pitch you something.
Yeah, I was noticing that somebody asks about what's possible in Office 365 as opposed to native or in-house SharePoint. Well, what we're looking in here should work just fine in Office 365. I can't say I've gone and built this specific thing there before, but this doesn't require anything special in SharePoint other than the ability to use SharePoint Designer.
Yep.
So whether you're doing something hosted, whether it's by Microsoft or somebody else, one of the other third-party vendors that offer SharePoint hosting, or if it's internal, whether it's the Foundation Edition or Standard or Enterprise, none of that should really matter for the things that are shown in this demo or in the video series.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can definitely attest to that, that Office 365 is completely SharePoint Foundation, and actually more. You can have external users also in Office 365. And SharePoint Designer usage in Office 365 is almost complete. It's almost exactly the same as the in-house deployment, the way you use SharePoint Designer for that. In fact, I'll tell you a short, quick story here which might shed some light on Office 365 and SharePoint Designer interactivity. A year and a half ago, I don't know exactly, but Microsoft contracted me to write a paper on using SharePoint Designer to customize Office 365, so especially SharePoint Online, of course, within Office 365. And I wrote the paper. It's on MSDN right now. But I got to tell you that one of the biggest challenges I had was to distinguish the things that you cannot do with Office 365 or SharePoint Online, compared to in-house, because almost everything you can. There was one thing missing at that time was the Business Connectivity Services, BCS, but even that now has been introduced with SharePoint Online, so you can do that stuff as well now. So all the stuff that Eric has shown, every single thing is definitely doable in SharePoint Online or Office 365.
I see another question here about whether the Webpart page we did was too advanced for a beginner to start with. I would say it's probably mid-range as far as Webpart pages go. The simplest things are, just inserting Webpart pages in the browser, or excuse me, inserting parts from the browser into a Webpart page. And there is some of that in the video series. But you can get far more complicated than these as well. The part that I think makes this a little more complicated than this one is the fact that you do have to go to code view for those couple of adjustments.
True.
Those are difficult to remember if you don't do them often. The good news is they are documented in the video series. You can also find them online if you do make a note about the EDWRT:ghost tag. You'll find information about it online.
Great.
So if you just need to find a text reference, it's available. We also had a question about master pages, because it's a really common question we get from people, is that they work in a site that's pretty tightly controlled, and there's only so many things they're allowed to do. And this person wanted to see if changing web parts or creating web parts like this breaks or customizes a master page. And the answer is no. The master page is what constructs in SharePoint kind of what's called the Chrome, the trim around the page, the standard structure, including like the site actions menu, the navigation bar, the ribbon, plugin menu up here. Those are customized from some organization, even on an internal site, to put in a corporate brand or to add extra links that they want to be on every page regardless of where it's used. And the type of changes we're talking about in this demo and in this video series do not require anything in the master page. So if you have the need to contribute in a site and to use SharePoint Designer, you can create a Webpart page and do this. No extra master page or page layout changes are needed for this.
Yep. And master pages, in my opinion, be careful whenever you're touching master pages, please. Usually I recommend people in my own capacity as instructor and consultant to have only site collection administrators mess with them. Master pages can break your site if you modify them incorrectly, so please be very careful.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's something generally I steer people away from.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean I never think there's a reason to do it. I've worked some places where they just completely forbid it. I don't necessarily agree with that either. But
usually why that happens, right, is because somebody's probably broken something in the past and have a bad flavor in their mouth. So, of course, modification to master pages or enhancements or making new master pages is essential. I mean, you'll see sites all over the place on the internet, like Ferrari.com or PaulMitchell.com or HawaiianAir.com. There's so many more, hundreds or maybe even thousands now, which are made using fresh master pages, new master pages, right? And these are all publishing sites in SharePoint. So it's definitely necessary, but it requires special skill. There's a lot of placeholders, a lot of different components of master pages, which if taken out, it really won't tell you anything that, hey, you're taking out an essential component, but it's gonna just basically trash your site. Or you'll find out later that maybe a calendar component is not working or something else is not working because of something that you did a few months ago. So please be careful and read up on it. Get a consultant involved if needed, or some kind of other guidance to do the right thing. That's all I'm going to say.
Agree completely. That's a really key problem, is what you mentioned there. You delete something from a master page, and you don't realize for 2 or 3 months that you broke something because it only shows up in this one scenario that you don't look at very often. And, that's really tough. A good rule of thumb, as he mentions, is know SharePoint well as knowing just graphic design, HTML, and that type of thing. So I've seen a lot of times people get just a website designer to create their Webpart page because they're really good at making it look nice.
Exactly.
But they can break it if they don't know much about SharePoint. A good rule of thumb is don't delete anything, just hide.
Very true. I'm sure people can tell that we've been victims of all these kind of things. This is a lot from experience, not just, not just professing it, but we've had issues like that in our environments. Great. So there's another one here. It talks about how do I set up task template? This is Daryl asking, how do I set up task template so I can reuse a series of tasks relationships?
And that's a good question. There are a couple of ways to go about that depending on what your goal is. Sometimes people, every time they have a project, it's roughly the same timeline, or at least the same starting point. We have the same 20 or 30 tasks that are in here, and then each project may get customized a bit. We add a few here, we delete something, we customize some of the tasks. But they have kind of that boilerplate timeline that they want every they create. If you want to do that, then what you can do, let me illustrate what I've got. It's my project task list. One of the things we talk about in the video series is templatizing, scaling up, and making templates out of the things you created so that you can have many copies of them. But we don't talk about necessarily saving, the list items that are in it. But if you do that, if you choose to save the list as a template, one of the choices it gives you in the form that will come up here in a moment is if you want to include the content. That would allow you to save the project task list with all of the existing tasks in it. That way, every time you would come afterwards to create something in SharePoint and you would choose to create your project task list, and the one it creates would already have all those items in it. I have seen several organizations that use that quite a bit because they do. Every project is very similar. Maybe it's event planning at a hotel, and it's the same 129 things that have to happen every time. It's just different people, different names, different details. Another thing you can do if it's not that predictable, you just need to duplicate these 7 or 8 tasks over and over through it, then the tool I've done is one of those caveman tools. I love caveman tools. Is you create a view that has all the columns in it that you need. Maybe a Gantt chart isn't the best one to look at. If I go to all tasks, then you can use this data sheet view, which puts it in more of a spreadsheet format. And you can just select it like you would in Excel, copy, and paste. And it puts them all in there again. So a couple of different answers there. I don't know if either of those are exactly what you were looking for or not. I've seen some people create workflows to do that, or they have a workflow that they manually fire, maybe a site workflow in SharePoint 2010. So you manually fire it and it creates this list of 8 tasks or something. Hopefully one of those helps you with the scenario you're asking about.
I think it will, definitely. Another question here is from, I hope I'm not butchering the name here, is Haichi. Haichi is asking, how do we roll up for different project tasks to a high level? I guess how do we roll up different project tasks to a high level? That's the question.
Okay. Good question. We have, let's see here. I've got it hidden in this one. It's a common question, and the answer is in a couple of layers. The project tasks that we have listed here, excuse me, these would need to roll up, for instance, percent complete, related to how many hours or how many points maybe in the Scrum scenario. You get a total for how many hours there are in the project, and then there would be a total for how many were done, total for how many were in progress, for how many were not started, and a different percent complete can be calculated from those.
Okay. Eric, you're still there, right? Eric, can you hear me? Are you still there? Let me just do a quick check here, guys, if Eric is still here or did his connection drop. Eric, can you hear me? If you can, we cannot hear you.
It's not the prettiest page in the world just because I wasn't finished formatting in this one. But the idea of having a separate workspace or a subsite for every project allows you to do just that. In the workspace, we talked about a list being a container earlier. A subsite is a larger container. Think of it maybe like the picnic basket. And then inside the picnic basket, you've got all the little Tupperware things that keep the different types of stuff separate from each other. So we now have a basket that has tasks, that has a calendar of events and milestones, perhaps deadlines. We have project announcements that show here on the main page. We have sprint history. You keep track if you're doing a Scrum methodology and you're planning sprints and executing them and want to track them across time. Discussion boards, action items. Risks and issues are something that we devote some time to in the video series as well. Project management is a lot more than just the tasks. You have to communicate with the team. You have to identify potential risks that may come up, potential issues and the risk associated with those, and then prioritize them by how likely it is to happen and how bad it would be if it did happen. So there is an out-of-the-box issues list that comes with SharePoint. And in the video series, we talk about some suggested other columns that you would put in here to manage both risks and issues together. That way, if it's just potential, it's something you're worried may happen in the future, it's a risk. And then if it actually happens, it becomes an issue, and you don't have to re-enter everything. You can just change the type of item in the list. For instance, we have a sample risk here. And if that actually occurs, I can convert this to be an issue. Notice we have settings in here to track the impact. How bad would it be if this occurred? And the probability, how likely is it to occur? Sometimes a risk is a big enough deal that you may want a whole subsite underneath your project to manage and mitigate that risk. So basically, we built this sample list on a calendar template, so it includes the workspace capability, so that you're able to have those subsites if you want. But as far as risk management, the idea of having categories so you can keep an eye on what type of a risk or an issue is it. Here's some sample ones that have come up with me in previous projects. Nice ways to delineate those. Due dates for when the mitigation either needs to be planned or implemented, depending on whether it's a risk or an issue. What strategy? Lots of different ways you can handle risks. You can avoid them just by not doing whatever it was that made the risk. You can reduce them maybe by the way you're doing the task or the way you implement the decision. You can transfer the risk. Maybe you get insurance or other legal means. You share that with some other party. or you can just accept it. We realize there is a risk here, but it's the benefit of doing things this way or of doing this task or project at all outweighs the risk. So just by creating some extra columns in the risk issue content type, you can give yourself a tool that makes it much easier to manage these over time. And again, to collaborate with your team members, because rarely is all this something that you're just going to do by yourself as a project manager. Whether you're trying to avoid or reduce or transfer or accepting, that's something the team has to be on board with so that everybody understands how things are going to be managed and mitigated. I like that one. I thought that was a good question. They're all good questions. Anything else stand out to you, Asif, from the list?
Let's see. There's a couple of them actually that had a similar ring to it about connecting an existing site, let's say an existing project pieces that you already developed to a project server or to a project. Not sure if it's doable or not. So let's see. There's one by Melody, for example. The exact question, because in case I'm messing it up, is we used to be on SharePoint 2007 and Server 2010. Okay, we've now moved to all 2010. Yes, SharePoint sites have been created at the same time as project site from project server. How do we connect these? Not sure that's really the focal point of this webinar, but any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, project server creates its own project workspaces that are very different from what we're talking about here.
Right.
As far as integrating those, like if you wanted to create your own kind of a caveman project site in addition to the official project server project workspace, you could do that, but making them talk to each other would be very difficult. Typically, the project server exists in its own web application, and it's a very controlled enterprise level type thing. So if you wanted to have kind of dual sites, I would think probably the way that would be the least amount of technical headache in maintaining and keeping would just be to add a link on each site, on the home page of each site using a links web part, and just add it to get to the other side. Probably not the answer they were hoping for. But it's really kind of a strategic decision whether you're going to use project server or you're not.
Right.
For a project, so it's.
Yeah, that's definitely a pretty big investment, and not just money but also resources. And if you're going to go that route, and if it's overkill, there's just a lot of stuff that you're not going to be using. But there's definitely value for it. Plan for it properly, and then and only then go to project server, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, and if you're going to do it, buy in. Really use it. I would recommend. I would probably steer you away from trying to do both. I would steer you more into trying to do as much as you can in the project workspace itself, one from project server. Because the more you invest in time and in data and emotionally in project server, the more successful that will be. If it's a foot on each side of it, then it's going to be very difficult to be successful.
All right, I guess we have time for maybe one or the most two more. So do you have anything that stands out, Eric? And while you're looking, let me also tell everybody that, we'll try our best, and we've this time allotted more than 25 minutes, I think, approximately, to answer the questions, but there's just no way that we can get to every question. Very sorry. However, if you do have a burning issue, if there's something that you want us to consult on, we do offer remote consulting. Eric offers remote consulting, myself, and then we have quite a few other people also who offer remote consulting, anything from 1 hour to above. So let us know if there's any need for that. And also one more thing I want to mention here, a couple more things before we take the last question is, The DVD that we've been talking about, it's on site, it's on the website. You'll find the link to the DVD in the newsletter that I sent out earlier. You'll also get the link to the DVD in the next newsletter, but you can see it on the site. And a couple of different coupon codes that I gave you in the website, I'm sorry, in the beginning of this presentation are also in the newsletter. But if you need them, let me know in the question and answer. I can put that here. In fact, maybe I can put that here anyway. Okay. Were you able to come up with any?
I did see one other great one that I'd really like to address. It asks, does your organization have SharePoint Designer enabled on the production server? If not, how do you do it on the dev server and deploy it on the production server? That is a great question. And I am a firm believer, and I know Asif is as well, of using SharePoint Designer in production. Particularly in the 2010 version of SharePoint, there are some controls you can put in place if you're on the admin side of this and you're afraid of that. Let me just show real quickly. If you go to the site collection settings, there's a SharePoint Designer settings option here where you can specify to enable it, and then you can do some of the scary things that people do with SharePoint Designer. You can disallow. For instance, this is that unghosting thing we were talking about before. You can let people make changes and create web parts and things like that without unghosting the page. So you can disallow that. You can disallow the master pages we were talking about earlier, if that's a scary thing in your organization. You can disallow people changing the folder names and things like that, which is probably a good idea. So there are controls in here that you can do and still let people use SharePoint Designer. SharePoint is really not built on the idea of doing things in dev and taking them into test and then into production. That's not to say it can't be done, but it greatly complicates the process and really gets away from the strengths of SharePoint. It's more of a classical development scenario in those cases. The good news is by using the graphic tools that come with it, that come with SharePoint, things like SharePoint Designer, InfoPath, things like that, you can do so much without having to open yourself to the same dangers that come from traditional development. Do you have any videos on the site, Asif? Are you talking about SharePoint Designer and production?
Well, not specifically that guidance, because the videos are much more how-to, but I mean, I've blogged about it, I've spoken at many conferences about it, and like you said, I'm a very firm believer. I've talked to the Microsoft personnel many times just to confirm the messaging, and yes, SharePoint Designer is for production. I know many of you probably don't like hearing that, but that's what it's built for. There are things that you can package, yes, but for a lot of stuff, content type, site column management, workflows, and everything else, they're meant to be done in production. It is what it is. So if you have any more questions on specifically to that, send me an email and I'll give you at least a piece of my mind, whether you agree with it or not. Okay.
The other thing I'll point out, if your admins don't let you do it, it's going to be difficult, but what you can do is create the entire site, including the workflows and data view web parts and things like that. And then you can save the site as a template in the site settings and tell it to include the content, and that's as close as you can get without doing true development type work.
True.
Packaging. But it'll create a little WSP package that in theory you can move from environment to environment. It's probably not going to be smooth, but it may make it possible for you.
Exactly. And that is actually shown in the videos of how you can take, for example, a workflow, a reusable workflow, and package it into a WSP file and you take it from an environment to another environment. We have videos on that on the site. With that, let me go ahead and wrap it up. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining. And thanks, Eric, for a great presentation. I think you did an awesome job. I hope everybody else agrees.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Enjoyed it.
Great.
We would obviously be glad to help if you have more needs.
And for folks who want to review this webinar again, or if you want to show somebody else this webinar recording, it will be available on our site on SharePointVideos.com. If you go to the free videos tab on SharePointVideos.com, you'll see the past webinars, and this new webinar is going to go there as well. So look out for that. Like I said, it should be there within a few days, and you'll get a newsletter telling you the exact link of where it is. So with that, Thank you very much once again, and we hope to see you guys again in the next webinar. Let us know if there's any questions about any of our services. Take care and have a great rest of the day. Bye now.